So we are going to read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through chapter 12, verse 3. It's 1876 in your pew Bibles, if you guys want to open up to that. I just want to say real quick, the first time I ever saw someone get baptized, I felt something. I didn't know what it was. That was about 10 years ago, but I remember feeling something, and it was really cool to see Bob do that.
Amen.
Yeah. So, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in goatskins, destitute and persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Going into chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
We're visiting with our guests, as I mentioned before, so we're thankful that you're here. And encourage you, if you will, to open to that text if you're not already there. I want to thank everybody that filled in while we were gone. We had a good trip, and I'm just thankful to be back. I was thinking as I was sitting there in the front pew how much I enjoy our family here. Such a precious family, and it's so very special. And I'm just so very thankful for it, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to worship and be with you during this time. There's a couple things I want to remind you of. First of all, I just want to give you this mug shot. If you see any of these people, then report it, because this is the picture, the photo picture of Fellowship Friday that took place. I understand there are a number of people who tried to get there, but there was so much traffic they couldn't get there. But this was a good turnout. Karen and I missed it this year because we were just getting home. But I just want to remind you of it. I always like to. Nick always sends me the photo because it's a special time. I'll encourage you, if you have an opportunity to be there, to share in that time. The other thing I'll remind you of is our special contribution, and I think Andre was sharing about it on the 10th. Ganderberg Christian Camp has had a great influence on this congregation, on our young people over the years. And they have a need, of course, to replace the dorm. It's going to cost about $450,000. They have raised and matching contributions, $225,000, and they need to raise another $225,000. And so the men have decided that on the 10th that we are a special contribution, and I just want to encourage you, if you will, if you can find it in your heart, to contribute towards this, and we'll forward that on to them. Let's go to God in prayer. Lord, we're so very thankful for all you've given us. We thank you, dear Lord, for this precious time to be together. And we ask, dear Lord, that you bless it. Maybe a time, dear Lord, that we can encourage one another, a time that we can lift our hearts in praise to you. We are so very thankful, dear Lord, for the privilege to be called your children. Lord, we're thankful this morning for us to celebrate together the baptism of Bob into your kingdom. And we pray, dear Lord, that as he begins his walk, that you're with him. And that truly, dear Lord, as his family, that we might continue to encourage him as he encourages us. Lord, we thank you for your love. We thank you for your mercy and grace, and celebrate that as we gather on the table. And we're continually reminded, Lord, of that truly, dear Lord, our salvation comes from your grace. For there's nothing we can do to earn it. For that, dear Lord, we stand at all at your tremendous love. Lord, thank you. Thank you, dear Lord, that we can be together. Thank you, dear Lord, that we can celebrate together. Pray in Jesus' name, amen. And so right after worship this morning, of course, we'll have our celebration. We'll celebrate with Bob together. You know, I have found this time of year to be special. I think we're only like 5 weeks away from 2018. It's hard to believe it's 2018. It's 2018. And I have always found that this period between Thanksgiving and Christmas is an excellent time to do some evaluating. How's the year gone? Where am I at? And especially, where are you at spiritually, in your spiritual walk? See, it is so easy to become lazy spiritually. And it is so easy to become lax in our walk. And I thought maybe we need to spend some time in this period that is so busy and so many things happen, but we pause during this period to kind of take an evaluation of where we're at. There's a text I was reminded of. Paul said this when he was writing to the Corinthians. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in a game goes in strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave. So after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." Now, these are very interesting things that Paul is saying here. First of all, the thing I want us to focus on to begin is he compares the Christian walk with a race. Not really a speed race, a marathon. A marathon that I feel very confidently that he's witnessed a couple times during the games. And that marathon reminded him of the Christian journey. And he's saying, you know, the guys that approach this journey, this marathon, they're focused. They're focused on this race. This is all they're consumed with. There's an intensity here. And he's saying basically that that's the attitude that we need to have in this Christian walk. That we need to have this focus, this intensity to make it to the finish line. And of course, he's saying, now those guys, they just got this crown of wreath. But we get something much more important. An eternal crown. And isn't it interesting in that text that Paul even says that there is something here that even though he's engaged in active ministry, that he must continue to buffet his body, beat his body, bring it under submission. Why? Because if he becomes lax in spiritual discipline, what happens? He'll miss the goal. And doesn't that surprise you? That Paul says that even though I'm engaged in ministry, even though I think that I can miss the goal because I've become lax spiritually. And so he says, I make sure, I keep checking to make sure I'm focused. Focused on this journey. Sunset Commentary makes this. I think it's interesting. Paul's purpose was to be able to run so he might not be disqualified or rejected, so he might gain the prize. This is surely rebuke to any half-hearted service that Christians might offer to Christ. I'm going to repeat that. There's surely rebuke to any half-hearted service that Christians might offer to Christ. Paul made sure that he was qualified to receive the crown forever by setting a goal rather than running aimlessly in his Christian walk. It is so very important that we're putting in the intensity, the focus in our lives in this race. That we're investing in this race. Because the sad reality is that no matter who we are, and that's really the point that Paul's getting across, no matter who we are in danger if we become lax in drifting spiritually. The Hebrew writer put it this way: we must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we've heard, so that we do not drift away. For if the message spoken by angels was binding, and every violation, disobedience received this just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? I mean, one thing that Hebrew writer is making clear is that there's always the possibility that if we become lax, of drifting. Basic English version puts it, for fear that by chance we might be slipping away. The Greek word that's used there for drifting means to float by or drift past as a ship, or to flow past as a river. You know, one of the things the Hebrew writer is getting across here is the idea that very often our danger that exists in our walk is not that we make a radical change, not that if we one day wake up and decide that Jesus Christ is no longer Lord. No, he said the greater danger is, the danger that I think all of us need to look at, the danger that I need to remind myself of, and that is, it's a slow drift. A change in focus, a change in intensity, a change of priorities. And the wording used there is if overnight, as things go on, as this drift continues, we get farther and farther away until the ship can no longer be seen. And we get to a point where we wonder, how did we get here? How did this change take place? And I will suggest to you, it didn't take place overnight. There was a drift taking on. And it's scary. It's scary when I sit there and observe it in a Christian's life. And it's a change of priorities. Where, for instance, worship is no longer a priority in people's lives. There are other things they allow to take place in place of worship. Where Bible study and prayer is no longer a priority in their lives, and so they begin to drift. Sometimes even a priority of having and being part of Christian fellowship is no longer a priority in their lives, and therefore there's a drift that takes place. Sometimes it's an attitude or a sin that we know in our lives that we're not willing to change, and therefore we hold on to. And it begins a wall in our heart, and we begin to drift. Listen again to the warning. I need to hear the warning. Easy to read version, so we must be more careful to follow what we were taught. We must be careful so that we will not be pulled away from the true way. You know, the concept that Hebrew writer is getting across here is that the Christian walk requires work and diligence and focus. You cannot cruise. For if you cruise, then Satan's going to get in there. You know, I've told you a number of times, there is no neutral in the Christian walk. Either you're progressing, and if you're not progressing, you're going backwards. The interesting thing in this text here, in Hebrews chapter 2, is that Greek word that's used, be more careful. It actually means have a hyper-intensity. A hyper-intensity and focus upon the spiritual race. Why? Because there's an ever-present danger we can begin to drift. It is so easy to become lax spiritually. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that there was a real danger that in the end, if he became lax, he could miss the prize. And so I want to ask a question. It's a question we're going to explore in December. But this question I want you to think about is, how much are you investing in this race? As we approach 2018, where are we at spiritually? What's happened with our priorities, our focus, our intensity? Maybe it's time to draw a line in the sand. Maybe it's time to step up our game, to get more focused, to be focused on our walk. Because there are a lot of competing voices, isn't there? There's a lot of competing voices that want to distract us. There's a lot of competing voices that want to take our attention. The Hebrew writer made this statement, isn't it interesting, when he says in Hebrews 10, verse 35, so do not throw away your confidence. It'll be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. See, the Hebrew writer is saying is faith, and the faith that God demands is all about perseverance. And a perseverance that does not back down, no matter what. That's what I mean by drawing the line in the sand. The concept that's there is the idea that the quality and character which does not allow one to surrender circumstances or succumb under trial. It is the enduring faithfulness to God and his will, no matter the circumstances. And that is very evident in our text. But I want to start right in the middle of our text. Look at, if you will, Hebrews chapter 12. Beginning of verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Considered him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. The Hebrew letter is written to Christians, Hebrew Christians, who are on the brink of going back into Judaism. And as you read through this letter, you realize that, as it mentions in Hebrews chapter 2, some had begun to drift spiritually. Some had become lax in their growth. Remember what it says in chapter 5. By this time you ought to be teachers. Some were no longer engaging in fellowship with the body. Hebrews 10 verse 24. And some had again allowed the pursuit of the world and not spiritual pursuits to be their focus. There's a really special graphic I want to share with you. See, Kim just got a real big smile on her face. Back in 2000, June of 2000, when I began preaching at this conference, you realize it's going on in the middle of 18 years. But I asked Kim to do this graphic. Back then, remember, I did overheads. But to do this graphic. And I've only used it once, again, since, the last 17 and a half years. And I thought it's worth pulling out the mothballs because it's special. And besides that, Kim did a great job with it. But this is the model. This is the model we see. Because like Hebrews chapter 12 and 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, as the Hebrew writer says, this journey as a Christian is a race, a marathon. And there's a lot of attributes that Ken gets across here in this. It's all found there in Hebrews chapter 12. For this race is being cheered on by this great cloud of witnesses. In order to run this race, it says there, we've got to remove the sin that so easily entangles us. He says that as we run the course, and the course is basically the trials, the suffering, the joy, the disappointments, and temptations that we face in life, he says we've got to run it with perseverance. Where he says heaven is our goal, and that we're able to make it because Jesus is our focus. And isn't it interesting that the Hebrew writer says, if we do that, if this model takes place in our lives, that we will not grow weary in this journey. That we won't give up. That we'll run with the intensity that God demands in this race, this marathon that we're part of. And we won't be disqualified for the prize. So as we approach 2018, we're going to explore this model together. We're going to remind ourselves of the things in place that we need to have to run this marathon. Now, the first thing that it says, that therefore there. And that is the Hebrew writer says, we have this great cloud of witnesses that are cheering us on. Who are these witnesses? Well, Hebrews chapter 11 is what we call the roll call of faith. These witnesses are people like Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab, and others. Because they are all ones who faced great odds and adversity in being faithful to God. But they persevered no matter the cost. See, they're the witnesses that we need to hear from, because that's basically the model of faith that we need to understand. That the model of faith that they display to us, the things they're telling us about, the stories they're telling us about, is that we need to persevere no matter what takes place, no matter what curves or issues or trials that we have to face in this life. And place our trust in God. And so the Hebrew writer is saying, as we run this marathon, we need to hear their voices behind us. The voices of one, think in terms of an Olympic stadium, and they're sitting in the stands cheering us on. And so as we're running the race, we hear the voice of Noah. And Noah's reminding us, he says, keep on running. Remember, God gave me a task. It made no sense to build an ark. He was going to destroy the world. But he says, faithfulness is doing what God says even when it makes no sense. Keep running. And then we hear the voice of Abraham. And Abraham is saying, remember that Sarah and I, we were told by God to get up and leave the land of our home. And go to a land that we knew nowhere to go. We had no GPS. We had no maps. But God said, go. And we did it. And Abraham's yelling to us, that's faithfulness. And then there's Moses. And Moses is yelling for the crowd. He says, remember. He said, remember, even though the journey's difficult. He says, I know very well it was difficult. For 40 years, it was difficult. But he says, remember, if you're faithful to the end, you'll make it to the promised land. See, that's what he means by this great cloud of witnesses. In verse 36 of the text that Jaron read, it said this. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. What's the point the Hebrew writer is making? He's saying that's what faith looks like. Faith is a determined perseverance to remain faithful to God no matter the circumstances. No matter what we have to face, no matter what we have to overcome. That's the point that he's making. Here's your great cloud of witnesses. All of them remain faithful. And the amazing thing the Hebrew writer says is they didn't have the whole story. They didn't have the complete picture that we have. They didn't have all the blessings that we have. For he goes on to say there in verse 39, all these were all commended, talking about this great roll call of faith in Hebrews 11, for their faith. Yet none received what had been promised. God planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. These men and women put on display for us so we can understand what faithfulness means. That we remain focused on God and doing His will, no matter the cost, no matter how ridiculous it sounds. I don't know what your favorite story is as you read through that roll call of faith. Mine is of the latter half of Abraham's life. The Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who received the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. That's faith. Remember the story? God told Abraham to take his son Isaac and go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. And I've thought about that. I thought, kill his son, his one and only son, the son who was promised to be the leading promise that all the nations of the earth be blessed, and go through him. I know very often I think to myself, is I would start rationalizing and start saying, God really doesn't know when to do this. I mean, that makes no sense. God would not require me to go and kill my son. I mean, really? God expected him to do this? Yes. God expected him to do this. The sacrifice his son. Why are we seeing this? Why is that story there? Because to help us understand what faithfulness means. To help us understand what obedience is. How faith actually is played out in obedience. That's why it's there. See, all too often, we make those arguments, don't you? I know I've rationalized at times, and I said, God really wouldn't expect me to do this. Give up this. Change this. But that's us. Isn't it interesting, and as the story unfolds here, that of dealing with Abraham, is we don't hear these excuses from him. We don't hear these arguments from him. We hear him moving forward, gathering the wood, taking his servant, and taking the journey. Can you imagine how the tears welled up in his eyes as they walked in that journey to Mount Moriah? I mean, his heart must have been broken when Isaac asked the question, Father, where is the sacrifice? Don't you know it just cut through him? I mean, I can't imagine taking little Oliver and doing that. I can't. But that's what God required. That's faithfulness. That God comes first no matter what. The perseverance and obedience to him comes first. That's the reason why it's even there. Why did God have him do this? Well, the Hebrew writer gets across to help us learn something of what faithfulness is all about. Can you imagine what it was like when Abraham put his son Isaac on the altar and he raised his knife to kill him? How can you imagine how bewildered and tear-filled eyes Isaac had? And of course, we know the story that God stopped him, but Abraham didn't know that. Abraham didn't know that. And it says, because he withheld his son, his only son, God said, you will be blessed. Because you persevered and you were obedient to me. And that's the faith, that's what this cloud of witnesses is yelling to us in this marathon. That we've got to remain faithful no matter the task, no matter what, that God comes first and in obedience to him. Nothing comes in that way. And we've got to trust him that however it works out, God knows what's best, and I trust him. I mean, isn't it interesting? The Hebrew writer notes that Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did raise Isaac back from death. See, Abraham said, okay, if I've got to kill my son, I have faith enough that God can deal with it. God will make it right no matter what it is. He'll put the pieces together. His promise will still take place. Sunset Commentary notes this. He, the Hebrew writer, will show them how faith acts under stress and persecution. Faith always leans on God. He wants to impress in the mind of his readers that they need to learn how to depend on God. Though external circumstances may give an impression that God has abandoned his children, or they are left prey in the hands of the enemy, it is always true that even when others hurt us, there can be divine purposes that can be accomplished for the man who has faith. See, that's what they're yelling to us about in this journey. That's what they're reminding us of. Do you have that kind of faith? Do I have that kind of faith? See, that's the question I want us to think about. Where we might need to step up our game. Where we might become more intense in our focus. See, as we're running this race, can you hear this great cloud of witnesses? Do you hear their voices? It's not just a bunch of stories that were put in place until we got to Christ. They were there to help us understand something of what faith was all about. The faith that God requires. And they keep shouting to us. They keep shouting to you. They keep shouting to me. And what are they shouting? They're shouting, Artie, keep running. Keep persevering. Keep trusting me. No matter the price of being faithful, you remain faithful. That's what they're yelling. Let me say this. If anyone tries to tell you that the Christian walk does not require this kind of intensity and faith, it's a lie. Because it does. Are we there? I know I'm not there yet. And that's why I'm so thankful for grace. But it's where I should be progressing to. It should be my goal. It should be the thing that I continue to work towards. Because if we become lax, then there is a very great danger of beginning to drift. And our priorities change, and our focus changes. And we don't become stronger, we become weaker. Listen to the voices. That great cloud of witnesses. But they're saying, keep running. Keep running no matter the cost. Keep running no matter the obstacles. Keep running no matter what you have to face. Make God the sole point, focus of your life. Keep running. Because they're saying, if you remain faithful no matter the cost, you win. And you will not be disqualified for the prize. That's the call. That's the call it says. And I really want us, as we go through this process together and as we come into this new year, and new years are arbitrary, but as we come to this benchmark, that we ask ourselves the question, am I running this race with that kind of intensity? That kind of focus? Or do we need to evaluate things and maybe step up our game? Get more focused, more intense. Maybe shift our priorities and what we need to do. Let's stand and sing a song.